In this video, we're going to follow the life of a young farm boy from Texas who was never meant to be a hero. He was a man whose job in the United States Navy was to cook, clean, and carry trays. Yet on a quiet Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor, he would pick up a gun he had never been trained to use and carve his name into the history of World War II. This is the story of Dorie Miller, the black sailor whose courage rose above prejudice, fire, and steel. Dorie Miller was born on October 12, 1919, on a small farm near Waco, Texas. His parents, Connery and Henrietta, were sharecroppers, working hard soil that never seemed to give enough back. Like many black families in the Jim Crow South, they lived with constant economic pressure and limited opportunities, but also with a fierce pride in family and community. From a young age, Doris was big, strong, and quietly determined. By his teenage years, he stood about 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds with the build of a natural athlete. On the family farm, he plowed fields, hauled bags of cotton, and tended the animals. The work was exhausting, but it also turned him into a powerhouse of muscle and stamina. At Moore High School in Waco, Doris found one place where his size was a clear advantage: the football field. Coaches put him at fullback, and he became known for smashing through defensive lines like a battering ram. When teammates remembered him years later, they didn't talk much about his grades or jokes. They talked about how hard it was to bring him down once he started running. But even for a talented young black athlete, the road ahead in Texas in the 1930s was narrow. Jobs were scarce during the Great Depression. The local mills and shops had little to offer, and racial segregation kept black workers at the bottom. Doris tried to find a way out. He applied to join the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of the New Deal programs that gave young men work, but he was turned down. He considered the Army, but that door also closed. By the time he neared his 20th birthday, Doris felt the weight of responsibility. He wanted to earn money to help his parents, to see more of the world than dusty farm roads and cotton fields. The United States Navy offered a path, even if it wasn't a fair one. When Doris walked into the Navy recruiting station in Dallas in September 1939, Europe was already at war. Nazi Germany had invaded Poland just weeks earlier. The United States was still officially neutral, but the oceans were becoming more dangerous every month. The Navy needed men. Yet for a black recruit like Doris, the choices were brutally limited. The Navy was segregated by race. Black sailors were almost entirely confined to the steward branch. They were messmen and cooks, responsible for serving white officers, cleaning their cabins, washing dishes, and preparing food. They couldn't qualify for most technical skills, couldn't become gunners or radiomen, and they were barred from becoming commissioned officers. Even promotion within the steward branch was slow. Doris signed anyway. On September 16, 1939, he enlisted as a mess attendant 3rd class. For him, the uniform still meant a steady paycheck, 3 meals a day, and the chance to travel far beyond Texas. After basic training at Norfolk, Virginia, he joined his first ship, the USS Pyro. Not long after, in January 1940, he received a new assignment that would shape his fate: the battleship USS West Virginia. Aboard the West Virginia, anchored with the Pacific Fleet, Doris settled into the routines of shipboard life. He rose early to prepare breakfast, carried coffee and plates into the officers' mess, and scrubbed floors and tables once the meals were done. It was tiring work, but he approached it with the same quiet discipline he had learned at home. He also rediscovered his love for sports. The Navy encouraged boxing as a way to build morale and toughness, and on the West Virginia, the competition was fierce. The big Texan quickly made his presence felt in the ring. Before long, he became the ship's heavyweight boxing champion, a respected figure among the enlisted men. It didn't change his official rating, but it earned him a different kind of recognition. Still, the boundaries of race were everywhere. In the chow line, in the sleeping quarters, in the assignments posted on the notice boards, black sailors were constantly reminded that they were considered servants, not warriors. Navy policy assumed that men like Doris would never stand behind an anti-aircraft gun or command a combat team. Their job, in the eyes of the institution, was to serve quietly in the background. History would soon force the Navy to confront how wrong that assumption was. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 7, 1941, the waters of Pearl Harbor were calm. On Battleship Row, the great ships of the Pacific Fleet rested at anchor. On board the West Virginia, Doris Miller's day began like many others. Shortly before 8 in the morning, he was collecting laundry from the sleeping quarters, thinking about nothing more threatening than the tasks ahead, and maybe a boxing match later in the week. At 7:55 a.m., everything changed. Japanese carrier aircraft roared over the island of Oahu, and the first wave of torpedo planes lined up on the harbor. Alarms screamed through the battleship as explosions erupted nearby. The attack on Pearl Harbor had begun. Doris heard the general quarters signal and did exactly what he had been trained to do. He ran to his battle station, an ammunition magazine for an anti-aircraft battery amidships. But when he reached it, the compartment was a wreck. A torpedo had already smashed into the side of the West Virginia, tearing through the space where he was supposed to work. His assigned station no longer existed. For a moment, the young mess attendant had no clear orders. Smoke was filling the passageways. Men were running past him, some shouting, some stunned into silence. Instead of freezing, Doris made a decision. He went looking for ways to help. He moved toward the center of the ship, a crossroads known as Times Square, and reported himself available for duty. It was there that officers, recognizing his strength, directed him toward the bridge. On the bridge of the West Virginia, Captain Mervyn Benyon had been gravely wounded by shrapnel. Doris and other sailors tried to move the captain to a safer position under heavy fire. Working together, they carried him away from the exposed bridge and laid him in a sheltered spot behind the conning tower. The captain refused to abandon his ship. Even as blood soaked his uniform, he continued to issue commands until he finally succumbed to his wounds. With torpedoes still slamming into the battleship and bombs falling around them, Doris kept moving. He helped drag injured crewmen through smoke and pools of oil, bringing them toward the relative safety of the quarterdeck. But the attack was far from over, and the West Virginia needed every gun it could bring to bear. Near the conning tower, 2 Browning .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns stood unmanned. An ensign and a lieutenant were trying to get them into action as Japanese dive bombers shrieked down toward Battleship Row. They called for help, and when they saw Doris towering above many of the other men, they ordered him to assist. By Navy regulations, a black mess attendant was not supposed to be handling those weapons. Doris had never been formally trained to operate a machine gun. At first, the officers expected him to feed ammunition belts while they did the firing. But in the chaos and smoke, something different happened. While the officers turned to other tasks, Doris stepped up to one of the guns. He watched how the controls worked, how the sights tracked along the sky. Then he wrapped his big hands around the grips and began to fire. For around 15 minutes, as waves of Japanese aircraft swept overhead, the cook-turned-gunner held his position. He swung the gun back and forth, tracking targets, firing short bursts, then longer streams. Other sailors nearby later recalled seeing planes break off their runs or fall out of the sky under the combined fire from the West Virginia and the ships around her. Officially, the Navy credited him with at least 1 confirmed aircraft destroyed, though some witnesses believed he brought down more. Doris himself didn't brag. Later, when journalists asked how he had managed to handle the weapons so effectively without training, he answered with simple honesty. He said that he just pulled the trigger and it worked, that he had watched others use the guns before and did the same. Behind that modest answer lay something deeper, a natural sense of calm under pressure, a willingness to act when everything around him was collapsing. As the attack on Pearl Harbor raged, the battleship West Virginia was in dire straits. Fires burned out of control and ammunition was running low. Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, seeing the chaos, ordered Doris Miller to stop firing the machine gun and get back to rescuing the wounded. The ship had taken multiple torpedo hits, and damage control crews were desperately fighting to keep her from capsizing. They managed to counterflood compartments, settling her onto the shallow harbor bottom instead of letting her roll over like the nearby USS Oklahoma. But the cost in lives was still terrible. Through it all, Doris labored. Surrounded by choking smoke and wading through oil-slicked water, he pulled sailors from flooded compartments, dragging them up ladders and across the dangerously tilting deck. When the final order came to abandon ship, he was one of the very last to leave, swimming through water streaked with burning fuel to find safety. By the time the attack ended, West Virginia had been hit by at least 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Over 100 of her crew were dead. The ship was a wreck, settling on the bottom with her superstructure still ablaze. But many sailors who might have died that day survived, thanks in part to a mess attendant from Waco, Texas, who refused to be defined by the limited role the Navy had given him. In the weeks that followed, stories began to spread. Sailors in barracks and on Liberty spoke of an unnamed black sailor on the West Virginia who had carried his dying captain and then fought back with a machine gun. Reporters caught wind of the rumors, but they couldn't find a name. On January 1, 1942, the Navy released a list of commendations. Buried in the list was a brief mention of an unnamed colored messman who had shown extraordinary courage. This omission wasn't an accident. In a segregated military, celebrating a black sailor so publicly was considered politically risky. But people outside the Navy wanted to know his name. The black press, led by influential newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, launched a full-blown campaign to identify this hero and demand he receive proper recognition. Civil rights groups, including the NAACP, joined the cause, calling for him to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Finally, in March 1942, the hero got his name back. Newspapers across the country revealed that the brave mess attendant was Doris Miller from Waco. One headline misspelled his first name as Dorie, and that version stuck, transforming a name often given to girls into a unique and powerful nickname for a new American hero. The campaign for recognition exploded. Letters flooded Congress and the Navy Department. For Black Americans, Dorie Miller became a powerful symbol of their own struggle. He was a man who had been denied equal status, yet had risked everything for a country that still treated him as a second-class citizen. At the same time, some white politicians, especially from northern states, saw the power of his story as a tool to unite all citizens for the war effort. Faced with this immense pressure, the Navy could no longer downplay Dorie's actions. On April 1, 1942, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox officially commended him. A few weeks later, President Franklin Roosevelt personally approved the award of the Navy Cross, one of the highest decorations for valor in naval service at the time. On May 27, 1942, on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, pinned the medal to Dorie's chest. In front of news cameras and rows of sailors, Nimitz praised his distinguished devotion to duty and extraordinary courage. He made a point of noting that this was the first time in the war that such a high honor had been given to a member of his race. Expressing confidence that others would follow his example, photographs from that ceremony became iconic. They showed Dorie, serious and dignified in his crisp white uniform, the Navy Cross hanging just below his collar. For many, especially Black Americans, this image was proof that their sons could be recognized as heroes, despite the suffocating barriers of segregation. But the Navy's attitude was complicated. For a time, Dorie remained a messman. The service received hate mail accusing them of turning a servant into a symbol, and they tried to carefully control his public image. Eventually, however, the leadership realized what a powerful asset he could be for the war effort. In late 1942, after a stint on the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, he was brought back to the United States for a series of war bond tours. From Oakland to his hometown of Waco, and at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station. He spoke to massive crowds, shook hands, and encouraged Americans to buy bonds to support the war. Posters appeared with his likeness and the phrase, "above and beyond the call of duty," urging young black men to enlist. The tour gave Dorie a taste of celebrity, but when it ended, he made a simple request. He wanted to return to sea. He had joined the Navy to serve his country, not to stand on a stage. By 1943, the tide of the war in the Pacific was turning. After the pivotal victories at Midway and Guadalcanal, the United States was on the offensive, pushing west across the ocean, island by island. New ships were pouring out of American shipyards, including a new class of small aircraft carriers called escort carriers. In May 1943, Dorie received orders to report to one of these new ships, the USS Liscum Bay. His rating had been upgraded. He was now a cook, third class, but his duties were still within the stewardess branch. The Liscum Bay joined operations in the Central Pacific, providing air cover for the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. In November, the ship was off Makin Atoll, launching its planes to support the troops on the beaches. The operation seemed to be going well. Thanksgiving was just around the corner, and the cooks had already broken out the frozen turkeys, planning a holiday meal for the crew after days of combat. But in the pre-dawn darkness of November 24th, a Japanese submarine, the I-175, slipped through the destroyer screen. Just after 5 in the morning, it fired a spread of torpedoes. One slammed into the Liscum Bay near her stern. The explosion was catastrophic. The torpedo had hit right next to the ship's bomb and torpedo storage, triggering a massive secondary blast that sent flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air. The carrier's stern disintegrated, and the ship began to sink rapidly. There was no time for organized damage control. Within about 20 minutes, the Liscum Bay was gone, taking more than 2/3 of her crew of over 900 men with her. Among them was cook third-class Dorie Miller. He was officially declared dead a year later. He was only 24 years old. Back in Waco, Dorie's parents received the telegram that every wartime family dreaded. They had watched their son become a national hero, and now they had to accept that he was never coming home. Churches held memorial services, and a granite marker was placed at his old school, a local tribute to a national sacrifice. In the years that followed, Dorie's legacy grew far beyond Texas. The Navy, the same institution that had once restricted him to the galley, eventually named a destroyer escort and later a frigate USS Miller in his honor. Schools, parks, and community centers across the country took his name. His story was told in radio dramas, songs, and documentaries, cementing his place as an early and powerful symbol of the modern civil rights movement. Yet for many, there has always been a feeling that Dorie Miller deserved more. Campaigns have periodically called for his Navy Cross to be upgraded to the Medal of Honor, arguing that systemic racism was the only reason he didn't receive it in the first place. But the debate over medals is only one part of his story. Perhaps more importantly, his actions helped change the Navy itself. The pressure created by his heroism, combined with the efforts of civil rights organizations, pushed the service to open more roles to black sailors. His story became one of the sparks that led to President Truman's historic order desegregating the entire armed forces after the war. In recent years, his memory has been honored in even greater ways. A towering bronze statue now stands in Waco, looking out over the Brazos River, and in 2020, the Navy made a landmark announcement: a future Ford-class supercarrier, one of the most powerful warships ever built, will be named the USS Dorie Miller. It's the first supercarrier named for an enlisted sailor, and the first named for an African American. Dorie Miller's story is about more than the chaos of Pearl Harbor. It's about a system that tried to limit who he could be. The Jim Crow Navy saw him as a mess attendant, fit only to carry trays. But when the crisis came, the bullets and bombs didn't care about segregation. What mattered was who stepped forward. Dorie didn't see himself as a political figure. His actions, however, spoke louder than any speech. By manning that gun and rescuing his shipmates, he proved that courage knows no color. For Black Americans watching from the sidelines of a segregated nation, his example was a powerful validation of their own worth and sacrifice. In the end, the image that endures is of a young man on a burning battleship, firing a machine gun into a sky full of enemy planes. No training manual told him to do it. He did it because the moment demanded it. Dorie Miller did not survive the war he helped define, but his legacy lives on. His story shows us how ordinary people, pushed to the margins, can rise to extraordinary heights when history calls. It's the story of how a farm boy from Texas, told he was only fit to serve meals, became one of the greatest heroes of World War II. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as powerful as we did, please like, subscribe, and share it with others.